So then, verse 9 of the foundation of all good qualities. Once I have pacified distractions to wrong objects and correctly analyzed the meaning of reality, please bless me to generate quickly within my mind stream the unified path of calm abiding and special insight. Once I have pacified distractions to wrong objects and correctly analyzed the meaning of reality, please bless me to generate quickly within my mind stream the unified path of calm abiding and special insight. So this is kind of a lot of technical things that are being introduced or explained in this stanza. Pacify distractions to wrong objects. That is, again, going along with renunciation that we've talked about, where at this point we've lost interest in accumulating wealth, in accumulating status, in just doing sort of the mundane distractions, the meaningless affairs of this life. And then correctly analyze the meaning of reality. We're going to get to that, in a little bit here in more detail. That is understanding that all things lack inherent existence. They are not set up from their own side. And then it says, please bless me to generate quickly within my mind stream the unified path of calm abiding and special insight. So calm abiding is here being introduced for the first time, which Geshe Zopa did a work, or did a series of classes on, which are on our YouTube channel. When he was here, he did a series of classes on calm abiding, or shamatha, or shine, all translations of the same concept. Calm abiding is the English, and it refers to a level of meditative absorption that is extremely deep. There's 9 levels of calm abiding, which refer to the training in concentration, the ability to, once a person has reached the 9th level of calm abiding, then a person is said to have fully qualified calm abiding, which is a very, very stable, very deep, concentrated mind that is incredibly beneficial for having meditative insights or meditative realizations. Our mind right now is quite scattered. We find that when we try to meditate, the mind is here and there, and it doesn't go very well. And so we find meditative insights to be quite difficult to generate because our mind is so scattered. So training in concentration is extremely important. And that's what a person is doing when they are trying to progress through the 9 levels of concentration. There are absorptions, meditative absorptions, that go beyond the 9th level of calm abiding, but those are actually considered to be so deep that they are not as useful for having analytical meditative realizations. There are other benefits to those absorptions, but the 9th level of calm abiding is presented as the most useful tool that we can use for actually analyzing these topics like impermanence and death and renunciation and karma, all of these analytical topics. The 9th level of calm abiding is very helpful for having a really, really calm, focused, stable attention. And there's also what they call a mental and physical bliss and pliancy that arises when you've achieved fully qualified calm abiding. And that's also very helpful. You avoid fatigue. You can meditate for days at a time, even perhaps weeks at a time. There's just an effortlessness, there's an energy, an enthusiasm, all of which is incredibly beneficial for arriving at these insights. And for the insight on the nature of reality, it's actually necessary. You cannot have a direct, non-conceptual realization of the nature of reality without fully qualified calm abiding, because it's such a subtle object of meditation. As an analytical object, it's so subtle that any kind of less powerful mind won't resolve that object in your meditation sufficiently for enlightenment. So as a tool, it's actually necessary. We actually, if a person wants to achieve enlightenment, they have to develop fully qualified calm abiding. Now, our journey toward enlightenment probably isn't, probably is going to take more than just this lifetime. So if we don't develop fully qualified calm abiding between now and the time that we die, we shouldn't beat ourselves up about that. But it's a good, why not kind of aim for that? Why not sort of train and try to move in that direction as best we can? It is said to, historically speaking, what they say is that a person can develop it in a 6-month retreat. That's the historical understanding. As Geshe Zopa was saying, and as people generally say now, our minds are more habituated to distraction than the minds of meditators 2,000 years ago. So for us, 6 months is probably overly optimistic. But, it's doable. A person, and when I say 6-month retreat, what I mean is meditating like 8 to 10 hours a day, every day for 6 months straight. So you have to get to the point where that's a reasonable idea. It's not a reasonable idea to never have meditated and be like, oh yeah, I'll go do a 6-month long retreat. You'll go insane. It won't be productive. So the goal is to progress slowly, logically, reasonably, so that that becomes a reasonable idea for you. And then you engage in long retreat. It can't be accomplished outside of long retreat. That's also true. You can't develop, you can get to some level of the 9 levels in your daily life. You cannot get to the 9th level without doing long retreat. Perhaps, if you're an incredibly rare, special person, maybe, I don't know, but generally they say not possible without at some point doing long retreat. Long retreat meaning 6 months or longer. Geshe Zopa was saying that 3 years, a 3-year retreat is probably what it would take for most people. So that's intense, devoting 3 years of your life to meditating 8 to 12 hours a day. That's intense. I realize that's intense, but we can aspire to move in that direction. So the question in chat, what is the difference between a Buddha and a Bodhisattva? So in a way, it can be a little bit mixed, because when you look at the sutras and things, you can find instances of fully enlightened beings engaging in bodhisattva activities, doing the kinds of fulfilling the deeds of a bodhisattva or manifesting as a bodhisattva. But generally speaking, the difference is that a person progresses from an ordinary being into a bodhisattva, and then while training as a bodhisattva, continues to perfect their mind and achieves the state of enlightenment. So bodhisattva is a transitional period where they've realized bodhicitta in an uncontrived way, meaning that naturally and spontaneously, every action of body, speech, and mind is directed only at achieving full enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. That is a bodhisattva. And that insight will culminate as, flourishes into being a Buddha. But you use the bodhisattva vehicle to accomplish Buddhahood. But then, like I say, if you're looking at the sutras, it gets a little bit more complicated because it gets sometimes one Buddha can sometimes be referred to as a Buddha, sometimes referred to as a Bodhisattva. But for our purposes, it's like, it's kind of something that you use. It's the vehicle that you use to accomplish Buddhahood. Okay, so special insight then, the unified path of calm abiding and special insight. Special insight is distinct from, you could say, ordinary insight. So a person, a meditator who hasn't developed fully qualified calm abiding, they can have insights, meditative insights into the lamrim. They can have meditative insights even into emptiness. But they are ordinary insights. They're not special insight. Special insight is the kind of insight that arises when a person has fully qualified calm abiding and they meditate on karma or what have you. Whatever insight a meditator who's developed fully qualified calm abiding, the insight that arises due to the force of fully qualified calm abiding is called special insight. So you have you have calm abiding, and then you use calm abiding to analyze, and that gives rise to special insight. Any thoughts or questions so far?
There's several different paths to becoming Buddha or Bodhisattva. And is calm abiding on the path of, there's path of wisdom, path of...
Right, no.
I lose those.
Yeah. So calm abiding is so the question from Nagompa is calm abiding related to the bodhisattva grounds and paths, the five, which I was actually trying, just for the sake of time, I was sort of skipping over the bodhisattva grounds and paths. It's kind of technically part of the class, but we only have half an hour left, so I was trying. But the bodhisattva grounds and paths, they start when a person has they start when a person becomes a bodhisattva. So calm abiding is actually predates Buddhism. Calm abiding itself is just concentration. It's just a really, really highly focused state of mind. And the Buddha got it from the meditative traditions that existed in India that he grew up with, that existed at the time. There were mystics and people who existed in India who had fully qualified calm abiding. So that body of knowledge, actually, of calm abiding specifically, predated the Buddha. He did not invent calm abiding. He borrowed it. He said, like, oh yeah, this is great, this is really helpful. But it was a known part of Indian spirituality that existed at the time of the Buddha. So it's not related to the grounds and paths of a bodhisattva, which are the path of preparation, the path of accumulation, the path of seeing. Those are, so on the path of preparation, you're preparing to see empty. Those are all related to the direct realization of emptiness. So the way in which, to some degree, it is related is what I said, that you can't have a direct, non-conceptual realization of emptiness without calm abiding. So, but the bodhisattva grounds and paths relate to the realization of bodhicitta. You can actually realize bodhicitta without calm abiding, but you do have to develop calm abiding in order to see emptiness directly. So once you get to you can't get to the path of seeing without calm abiding. But you can be on the path of accumulation, the path of preparation. Those paths you don't have to have calm abiding to be on, but you'll be stuck. You won't get to the path of seeing until you've developed fully qualified calm abiding, because you can have what they call the correct inferential understanding of the nature of reality without calm abiding, but not a direct, non-conceptual realization of the of emptiness. So a person does, as I said, we unavoidably have to develop calm abiding to achieve enlightenment, or even to see emptiness directly. We will be prevented from reaching the path of seeing without it. So that's definitely true. Okay. Okay. Is that everything clear? Relatively clear? I know it's a lot of information all at once. So let's then spend the last half an hour looking at that insight of emptiness. I've been using the nature of reality, and I said that I was using that earlier in the course because it doesn't mean anything. Whereas emptiness, like when you hear the word emptiness, you think of a cup that doesn't have anything, or you think of like a room that does, you think of like empty space. So it kind of connotes something, and I was trying to avoid connoting anything until we could look at it in more detail. So I was using just the nature of reality, which is a nebulous idea. Also, emptiness or voidness. So what it means is, so this is the insight that everything is kind of leading up to in Buddhism. All of the stages of the path, all of the prior insights in the lamrim, they are creating the inner causes and conditions to see emptiness directly. And what's meant by emptiness, so empty of what? What is it that we're saying all things are empty of or void of? And what all things are empty of is existing inherently, existing independently, existing concretely, existing from the side of the object. So really, this concept of emptiness it doesn't really have anything to do with objects, with things. It's really a critique of how sentient beings cognize, how when we see something, when we touch something, when we taste something, when we hear something, when we're in relation to something, the act of cognition, it comes along with mistakes. The act of cognizing for an ordinary sentient being arises, coexistent with errors in that process of cognizing. And the error is that for an ordinary sentient being, like all of us, when we see something or we taste something or we hear something, we sort of, sort of instantly regard what we are in relation to as if we are passively noticing something that exists out there, separate from oneself, that has an essence, that has a independent, self-existent, concrete, real, findable essence to it. And because of its essence, we are kind of helpless, but to regard it as what it is broadcasting. It's like a chair that we are looking at has a neon sign that just says chair. And we have no choice but to observe that and think, well, chair, of course. It's a chair from its own side. It's a chair independently. It's an inherently existent chair. It has a nature or an essence of chair that is being broadcast to us. And all we're doing is just going through our lives and passively noticing what's out there separate from oneself. And the Buddha's observation is that that's not true. So, this concept of emptiness is not something that the Buddha invented. It's not like, Cubism, where prior to someone inventing Cubism, which is an art form, if you never, but prior to somebody inventing it, like it didn't exist, and now someone did invent it, and so now you can be a Cubist painter if you want to. It's not like that. The Buddha didn't invent emptiness. He noticed that things that people mistake what they relate to in this way, and that when they mistake things in this way, it causes all kinds of problems. And we can train our mind not to do that. We can get rid of this mistake that's happening not in objects. It's not, as I said, it has really nothing to do with objects. It has to do with the act of cognizing objects. It arises when we cognize. But we can train ourselves just like we can train ourselves to, overcome the false view of permanence that we talked about before, where, we recognize that we're going to die, but it's never today. It's always in the future. It's never something, we never really think it's going to happen. That's a mistaken view. And we can train ourselves not to think that way. We can train ourselves to be in tune with the reality that we really might die today, which is just true. That's just a valid statement. But we're not good at being in tune with that. But we can train ourselves to become good at being in tune with that. The Buddha also is saying that even though when we cognize, we think everything that we're cognizing exists out there, separate from our mind, which is engaging in that act of cognition, we can see through that mistake that we're making. And we can recognize that a chair, so the opposite of something existing in that false way, that mistaken way, that way of inherent existence, the opposite of that is to say that a chair does exist. No one's saying that we live in some sort of totally made up, dream world. They use phrases, as if it's like an illusion or like, but they don't mean that it literally is. So there is something out there, there is an object out there, but it just doesn't exist inherently. It doesn't exist from its own side. So the opposite of it existing from its own side is to say that it exists as a dependent arising. That is how things do exist. Things exist, but how do they exist? That's the question that the Buddha is posing. The Buddha is not refuting the existence of things. The Buddha is asking the question, how do things exist? They don't exist independent inherently. They do exist as dependent arisings. And what they depend upon are causes and conditions and parts and an act of mental imputation, an act of mental labeling, so, or designation. So a chair, to say that it depends upon causes and conditions, means that there's wood or plastic or metal that had, you know, origins outside, previous. It was a tree, it was ore, it was something else. And then it was melted, or it was shaped, or it was heated, or it was cut. It was, these are the causes and the conditions. And then there's parts. So there's a top, there's a bottom, there are legs, there's a front, there's a back, there's a left and a right. There's spatial parts. You can think of just the top. You can think of just the front right leg, etc. You can sort of isolate the parts of the chair. And in order for there to be a chair, you've got to have all of the parts, and they have to be combined in the right way to perform the function of chair. If you cut the chair into, if you remove the back and you remove the seat and you remove all of the legs and you spread them all out in the room on the floor, nobody would say that's a chair, because it doesn't perform the function of chair. You have to assemble all of those parts, and they have to be put together in the right way to give rise to the chair. And so then, independence upon the causes and the conditions and the parts, then we observe the object, and because of our culture, because of what we've learned, we then label it, oh, that is a chair. It is not a toaster. It is not a clock. It is a chair, because of the unique causes and the conditions and the unique parts and the way that they're arranged and the function that allows it to perform. We designate it or label it as a chair. The problem is, as soon as we label it or designate it as a chair, it appears back to the mind as if that chair is separate from me, is out there in the world, inherently existent, broadcasting its essence to me, and all I'm doing is just passively noticing what's there, when in fact I'm actively creating my experience of what's there by my active cognition. If I was from a culture where there were no chairs, I would be observing that object and I wouldn't be designating chair on it, because I have no referent for chair. So my ability to designate chair depends upon my having a previous referent for being able to designate chair. If I don't have a digital clock in my culture, in my society, I would be relating to a digital clock and I'd have absolutely no idea what it's doing, what you use it for, what its purpose is. Whereas someone else, they'd be like, oh, well, that's how you tell the time. The other person who doesn't have that in their culture, maybe they think it's a frisbee. Maybe they think it's, a toy that they use. They would use maybe some other referent that's part of their culture that's similar to what it looks like. And they would use it in the wrong, from our perspective, they would use it in kind of a weird way, because they have a different referent in their culture, in their mind, that they're using. So that demonstrates that there's nothing there from the side of the object that is telling the sentient being how to relate to it, what to designate it as. It's culture, it's past history, it's, what we've learned in our families and in our societies that tell us how to designate what we are in relationship to. But we don't think about that. We don't take that into account. We just think that the world is populated with objects that are out there, separate from me, that have their own essences, and we're simply noticing it. And so that's a mistake that sentient beings have always been making. Not like, again, it didn't just start happening when the Buddha was born into the world. And but it's just something that sentient beings, all sentient beings, are doing all of the time. And when we do that, we then think that, the real problem then is that we think that some things are inherently pleasant, some things are inherently unpleasant, and we think that the pleasantness and the unpleasantness is there, separate from me, part of the object. And I like pleasant things. I don't like unpleasant things. So I have to pull in pleasant things. I have to push away unpleasant things. So then that gives rise to actions, and those actions lay down karmic potentials in the mind. And then the most important problem, though, in all of this is that of all of the things that we cognize, the identity, the self, is one of those things that we think of as existing inherently. Um, we relate to our own identity as if it exists inherently from its own side, not as a dependent arising. What does the self arise dependently on? It arises dependently upon the body and the mind, and an act of mental designation that imputes self upon the body and mind. So there is body, there is mind, and they are interrelated, but the self actually exists as a dependent arising, not as an inherently existent or self existent thing. So that leads us to over exaggerate the things that happen to the self. To not only do we relate to external things as if some of them are made out of happiness and some of them are made out of suffering, which isn't true. But we also think that our interest in happiness and suffering is so important, and that we need to, because the self exists inherently, we have no choice but to follow the thoughts that arise in the mind, the desire to, to be uh, happy and to be free of suffering, which is Buddhism would say is our birthright, but we go about it in a very materialistic way, which is the problem, instead of cultivating the inner causes of those things. But of all of the things that we exaggerating the status of the self is the most problematic, because the self is what originates karmic actions. And when we exaggerate the status of the self, um, we're we're kind of powerless but to follow the what arises in the mind. When we want this, we just take it. When we don't want this, so because we exaggerate the status of the self, all kinds of problems follow. When we can overcome that exaggeration, then we're free from all of those problems, and we develop capacities of the mind, abilities of the mind that flow from getting rid of that false perspective. And that's what everything in Buddhism is leading us to being able to do, is to see through this false way of cognizing the self, the identity. We do exist. There is body, there is mind, but how do we exist? We exist as a dependent arising, not inherently. Um, and so, but like I said, it's a very, very subtle object that we have to develop single-pointed concentration or calm abiding to really, really cognize clearly. But even now, we can start to puzzle our way through it. We can start to recognize that it's valid, that it's a valid way of thinking. And then the question is just engaging in that over and over and over again, thinking it through logically. And we're just scratching the surface of this as a topic. There are thousands of pages that are written about how to demonstrate this philosophically. People study this for, years and years and years, how to have this insight. But the takeaway is that everything, that things exist, but their status is exaggerated when sentient beings cognize them, and they give them a solidity, a concreteness that isn't there, that is a fabrication of the mind, that is layered on top, added to what is there. There is body, there is mind, but we think that the identity, the I, the ego, is the owner of body and mind. We say, my body, my mind, which postulates this third thing that is the owner. Just like we would say, oh, well, the chair is red, or the chair is pleasing to me, or the chair is ugly, as if the chair, the concept of chair, is able to own its attributes, which is unnecessary. From the Buddhist perspective, that's a layering on top of what's there. And Buddhism would say we don't need to do that. We don't need to say that, like a car, we would say, oh, that's a nice car, or that's an ugly car, as if the label can own its attributes, can own its causes and conditions, can own its parts. And that's not true. There's no need to talk about it in that way. It's kind of a cognitive shortcut. It's kind of a quick and dirty way of, because there's so many objects, it's easier to just relate to them through their labels, to just relate to, chair and table, and it allows us to do things. It makes us productive. It's very useful, but it isn't true. It isn't valid. It's not accurate. And when we do that in relation to oneself, all kinds of negative karmas and problems arise. And we avoid all of those when we see through it. Buddhism doesn't postulate this insight is called what's called a non-affirming negation. So Buddhism doesn't say that it's not like this, but it is like this other thing over here. It doesn't then postulate something to replace the insight that things don't exist inherently. All we're actually trying to do is negate inherent existence. We don't then affirm something in its place. We just are trying to recognize that the view that we have of things existing inherently is mistaken. And that's it. We stop there. We don't then say, oh, this other thing is actually what's true. That's all. So it's a non-affirming negation. We negate inherent existence without affirming something else in its place. So it's kind of a groundlessness. It's kind of a freedom. We are thinking that things exist inherently, and we're just trying to recognize that, in fact, that is a construct of our own mind. But it is, the most difficult, most advanced topic in Buddhism. So it's something that people spend their whole lives trying to do. And all of the previous contemplations of the lamrim, their goal, their purpose is to kind of calm the mind down to the point where we could have that insight, to the point where the mind is stable and concentrated enough, and the delusions have been subdued, anger and jealousy and so on. All of these have been subdued enough that it becomes possible to have that direct non-conceptual realization of the nature of reality, or the emptiness of all things. So that means we can't just try to meditate on emptiness. We have to actually progress through the stages of the path, because all of the contemplations are leading us to having the kind of mind that can have a direct non-conceptual realization of the nature of reality. So unfortunately, we can't just skip to the end. We've got to master the small scope, and then master the middle scope, and then master the great scope. And from the Buddhist perspective, we also have to join wisdom realizing emptiness with bodhicitta. That's why bodhicitta is there. In the Theravadan tradition, they also realize emptiness. They also have wisdom realizing emptiness. They don't have bodhicitta. So they don't join wisdom realizing emptiness with bodhicitta. That combination is what allows for full enlightenment rather than lower nirvana, which is, if a person's practicing the Mahayana, that's what they want. They don't want lower nirvana, they want full enlightenment. So that's why bodhicitta is also part. That's why, for one, we move wisdom realizing emptiness to the great scope in the Mahayana, and we join it with bodhicitta. Because for a Theravadan practitioner, they have wisdom realizing emptiness in the middle scope because there is no great scope. Uh, so I realize that's a lot. I'm just trying to finish by 8:30 because that's when the class is over. So I'm sorry that that's a lot of information all at once. Any questions? Any thoughts? I know that that's an impossible question to ask, but
I think I'm going to try to put this together, but it might not make sense because that is a lot of information. So I'm probably pretty scattered on it. Like bodhicitta, which I know I don't perceive, but I think of sort of as compassion. At some level, I know that's not a full, obviously not a full description, but is that in a sense that in achieving that, we're already starting to take away our labeling of others, like our sense of perceiving that someone is only this or only that. If we were going to have compassion, then we'd have to have a more expanded view. Is that part of it?
yeah, like I said, I think all of these things are moving the mind in that direction. So equanimity, is helping us to calm down our conceptual mind, the mind of, this really active labeling mind. Like I said, I think all of these things are preparing the mind in various ways. So yeah, and so certainly great love and great compassion are integral parts of bodhicitta. Um, but bodhicitta is the realization that if you want to actually bring about your wish for sentient beings to be happy and to be free of suffering, they must achieve enlightenment. And if they must achieve enlightenment, oneself must achieve enlightenment first. Um, because anything other than the state of enlightenment is going to be characterized by suffering. And so it's only the state of enlightenment that's free of suffering. So it leads a person, great love and great compassion lead a person inevitably to what the solution is, and the solution is enlightenment.
Thank
But
you.
yeah, I think you can still, because inherent existence is much, much, much more subtle than friend, enemy, and stranger. And, because it's just that this person exists from their own side, separate from me, separate from any, that I'm not bringing anything to the table in my act of cognizing them. So ultimately, it is much more subtle. But like I said, I think, it's preparing the mind, it's moving the mind in the right direction, helping to create the inner conditions. But still, emptiness is its own topic. It has to be trained in, separately and independently. But all of these things are preparing the mind. Any thoughts or questions?
Is the lamrim something that someone can pick up at any portion, or should they start it like completely from the beginning?
Yeah, so we do. We the idea is that we do need to consider ourselves to, not have that we do need to master each and every contemplation of the lamrim from the first to the last. So Lama Zopa Rinpoche recommends, that we cycle through, for a while we cycle through the lamrim, because for us, that kind of repetition can be kind of boring. There is inevitably, inherently a lot of repetition that has to happen if we really want to have realizations of the lamrim. So in the monasteries and things, it could be that they might really meditate for, a year or 2 years on just one topic of the lamrim to really realize it in those 2 years. But for us to try to think about only meditating on one topic every single day, even if it's for, only an hour, a day, kind of overwhelming. So Lama Zopa recommends cycling, so spending like 1 month on each of the topics rather than 2 years. That's more manageable. I think at some point, maybe we have to adjust, but maybe spending longer at some point later down the road. But at least for now, like spending a month on, or even if you want to, like 2 weeks, if that seems more manageable, and cycling through the whole lamrim like that. And then I think gradually maybe extending those periods over time. But yeah, each of the topics of the lamrim have to be individually mastered, realized. So we consider ourselves to not realized even the small scope, because to realize the small scope means that we care more about future lives than we do about this life. So if we can genuinely say that that's true, then we've mastered the small scope. But genuinely being able to say that that's true is difficult, and I don't think that's true. Because we're caught up in what's happening tomorrow, what's happening, we care more about that than we do about what happens when we die. So that's the first thing that we have to overcome. Then we have to become someone who wants to put an end to cyclic existence as a whole. Then we have to become someone who wants to achieve full enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. So we do have to progress in that way. And how do we know? And, that's difficult. You kind of have to work with a teacher to be like, have I realized this? Have I not realized that? That's actual realizations. That's kind of something that you kind of have to work with a teacher on. But any last questions? Nope. All right. Well, we're out of time. So yeah, so we'll start Meditation 101 next week, and that's what we'll do for next month. Meditation 101, the companion class to this class where we're focusing more on meditation rather than philosophy. That's what we'll do for April, next month. Still on Fridays at the same time, but the Fridays in April will be on Meditation 101. Well, thanks for coming. Have a good night.